Radical Secular Podcast, a demand for justice, equality, and rational public policy. Subscribe at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and all the major podcast channels. Visit our website at theradicalsecular.com for articles, transcripts, and our complete library of episodes. Support us on Patreon, and follow us on social media.
Hello and welcome back to the Radical Secular Podcast. I'm Christophe Defoe.
I'm Sean Prophet.
Saturday was the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks which propelled the United States into a devastating 20-year slow-motion military defeat across the mountains, high deserts, and bustling cities of Afghanistan. To discuss this empire-altering series of events, me and Sean are joined by our friend Almir Osmanovic. Almir is a combat veteran who served in Afghanistan in 2006. We're grateful for the opportunity to discuss the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the war in Afghanistan, and their aftermath from his unique perspective. But first, I want to remind you that if you like our show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, check out our Patreon, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. And we publish new articles regularly on our journal at theradicalsecular.com. Okay, let's get into the t-shirt. Sean, what do you got today?
Okay, well, I have an interesting t-shirt because it has nothing to do with 9/11 or Afghanistan or anything that's the topic of our show, except kind of on a tangential level, because it's talking about capitalism. I want to show this to you right now.
Yeah, so it's a shirt with a bunch of brands on it, sort of bottles and cans and stuff like that. It looks like something from the 60s almost.
Yeah, and what this is, if you see at the top, it says Omega Mart. And Omega Mart is a project of this artist collective called Meow Wolf. And they are in Las Vegas. They're in this building called Area 15, which is a huge warehouse, a huge art installation. And what this is, it's an entire store. It's a whole satire on consumerism and corporations and brands. And it also incorporates a lot of conspiracy theories and existential stuff. I mean, it's really deep when you go in and look at it. And they've thought this through. There's a whole backstory and a corporate identity. And it reminds me a lot of these wacky package stickers from the 70s. I don't know if you ever had those, but what they were sort of satires of actual brands. But they were too close to the brand, and they all got it. The company that was making it got sued and shut down. But you used to buy these cards, and they were these or stickers that came in packs of chewing gum. And
yes,
all the kids had these all over their notebooks and backpacks and everything else like that. And it was weird takes on brands, making fun of brands. But Omega Mart is a lot smarter. They've done all of their own brands. And they've created an entire corporation, a dummy corporation, which is called the Dram Corporation. And it's got this sinister identity. And it's almost like the woman who's in charge of the corporation is almost like a cult leader. And they have these weird employee training videos where the employees are. So it's an experience. Anybody who's going to Vegas should not miss this. And especially if you're interested in art or satire, progressive politics, it's just like it hits all the notes.
Very nice. And so did you go there recently then?
Yeah, I've been there twice. We went there recently with a friend who came into town, and then we had gone there probably about 6 months ago ourselves. And it's I can't even describe what this place is like.
That sounds awesome. Well, one of these days when we finally are able to get on planes for pleasure, we'll have to come out there and check it out, and we'll do some riding, and it'll be great.
That would be a great time.
And that would be a great ass time. And so today, my shirt is, so my friend, let's put it this way. I like cats. And I don't necessarily like all cats, but I love my cats. And so it's an ongoing thing, a joke, right, with my friends and everything like that. So on my 40th birthday, which was about a month ago, a buddy of mine got me this shirt, and it is it's kind of hilarious. I'll show everybody.
It says a cab, which you might think would mean all cops are bastards, but actually it has a picture of a cat, and it says all cats are beautiful.
Yeah. And it's also, that is also like an anti-fascist sort of symbol as well. So my friend was like, you are really into anti-fascism, which is very, very true. I am very anti-fascist. I'm really into cats. And also, I love it because my first thought when I saw it was all cops are bastards, which I'm not a big fan of that phrase. I mean, I get why people say it, but like, so I was like, oh, wait, that doesn't sound like very me. But then I was like, oh, wait a second, though. It's about cats. And I do love cats and hate fascism. So
it's perfect.
It's a perfect fit. So before we get into the body of the show, I'd just like to touch briefly on my recent post on the Radical Secular Journal. It's, I guess, a little bit vain, but I just want to bring it up because I just, go ahead and if you will, take a look at it. Basically, I talk about motorcycling and other stuff, but I also talk about some stuff about the Radical Secular. And so, like, one of the issues that we're wrestling with is our name. It's not really we're wrestling with it, what we're discussing. And I actually ask for input from our listeners to come and let us know what you think. So about what direction we should go in. We like hearing people. We're a democratic organization. We like hearing from our folks. And by the way, you can earn yourself a sticker and some sort of merch, which we're still working on getting the merch, but we're going to do it. We're doing it. So we're going to get you some merch and stuff like that. So anyway, if you're interested, please do check it out at theradicalsecular.com. And we have a lot of interesting stuff there. We're writing stuff a lot. Sean writes a ton of stuff. Joe writes a ton of stuff, and it's always really thoughtful and really interesting. So please do check out the journal when you get a chance. So, Sean, you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I'm just excited about, everything you had in that article. I'm excited about it. And especially, I just want to encourage everybody to go out and buy Bone Shia, which is Coral Anakatiel's new book. We wrote the intro. Christophe and I wrote the intro for that. And so, and it was well received. And I think it's just going to be exciting that we were just very happy to be able to help her with her project. And we're excited to have our kind of description and take on that out there. So, that's cool. And also, just since you're mentioning about motorcycling, it's a 3-week countdown for me until riding season starts.
Yes,
3 weeks to a month, and the key for me is really a high temperature forecast below 90, which is it doesn't happen around here much in these parts, because that means an actual road temperature of like 97, which is about the limit for comfortable riding. And
yeah,
and I just want to mention real quick, we have one other exciting future goal for our project was coming up with an alternative constitution. And Joe and I were talking about this because, like, okay, well, everybody likes to complain about the Constitution, what's wrong with it, what we need to fix. It's like, well, we need to actually do it. Well, we found someone who actually already has done this, and he's a UC Berkeley guy. And so we made contact with him. He's going to be on the show. So I'm excited about that too.
Very exciting stuff, all of that. I'm so glad that you brought up Coral and her book and our intro. I think that was something that you and I worked on together, and it was a real pleasure to work on it with you, Sean, but also just a real pleasure to be able to contribute to such an important story. I mean, it really couldn't be a better crystallization of the sort of stuff that we talk about, why we started this project in the first place. It couldn't possibly be a more clear crystallization of that, and so we're really grateful to have been a part of it, and so I'm really glad you brought that up, Sean. Thank you for doing that. So let's move on to our guest segment. I am pleased to welcome to the show our friend Almir. I met Almir through my dear friend Lauren when she recruited me to attend a demonstration of sorts at a county council meeting here in New Jersey. It turns out that many of my interests overlap with Almir's, stuff like motorcycling, spending time with family and friends, fighting fucking fascists, all of that. So Almir is a really thoughtful, progressive, anti-fascist with a unique perspective on the United States' involvement in Afghanistan, and I'm looking forward to chatting with him. And so, without further ado, the Radical Secular presents Almir. Today, our friend Almir has joined us to share his perspective on 9/11 and the so-called war on terror. How are you doing, Almir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Out fucking standing. Now tell us about your t-shirt, if you will.
So here's one thing that I like. I like tacos, and I like riding motorcycles, and I like having friends that share my interests. So I'm actually wearing it's taco time.
Yeah.
With the little taco walking. So it's my way of thanking the Mexican culture for bringing this great food to us. So
I love it. I love it. Mexican food is like by far my favorite sort of, brand or brand. Wow, I'm such a capitalist. So it's sort of my flavor of food. I love it so much. And that's one of those things that I can eat it like 3 times a week, and tacos especially. I mean, tacos, I can put them down like, I don't know, grapes. They're just like, boop, boop. They're just so good. So good. And like you say, I love motorcycles.
Right, but let me put a caveat here. I don't go to Taco Bell because I don't think that is considered, real Mexican food. I think that's more like corporate Mexican food.
Yeah. They don't have real guacamole at Taco Bell, so fuck that.
Well, if the food is not made by somebody who knows how to prepare it well, it's just not the way it is, right?
That's a really important caveat. I always say this. I say this to my wife sometimes. It's like, if you're going to eat fast food, it's like, what flavor of sort of fast food do you want, right? Like, you can get that's Mexican flavor, right? You can get the American flavor, which is like more of a McDonald's or whatever. But the bottom line is, it's all basically the same processed garbage, just like flavored a little bit differently. That's all, Well, look, before we get into the heavy, nitty-gritty subject matter of our conversation today, speaking of motorcycles, let's talk motorcycles. So, Almir, I'm going to give you something of a softball question, but they're all going to be softball questions. But still, Almir, why is motorcycling so awesome? And why should listeners go and ride a motorcycle right now?
Well, for me, let me just go into the reason why I started riding motorcycles.
For sure.
This was probably back. I mean, I can remember this, and it's like one of those vivid memories that everybody has. When I was, 7 years old, we had a guy that was working on our house, and I remember him showing up at a stadium, which we had like recess, and he had I don't remember what it was. It was a really old motorcycle, and this was back in like 88. All right. I'm dating myself right now. So he showed up and he's like, let me take you around the stadium. And I hopped in the back of the motorcycle and he took me around the stadium. This is one of those times, we're Eastern European. So parents, kind of like, it's not like, hey, you got to put a helmet on. It's 1988. Safety protocols be damned, right? And it's like one of those things that's, like, I want to get a motorcycle. Every time it was like, I want to get a motorcycle. Once I get my own house in the garage and a place where I can store a motorcycle, I will get a motorcycle. Fast forward to 2014, having a wife that just says, she goes, just get something, whatever makes you happy. So she kind of pushed me towards it. I got my first motorcycle in 2014, started riding, ripe age of 32. And then, fast forward to 2021, 6 motorcycles later, 2 in the garage, about 45,000 miles underneath my belt riding. I don't think I'm going to stop ever. I think it's like one of those things that, it's like a drug, right? I can tell people that have never ridden a motorcycle before, like, this is how it feels. This is how, unless you get on the motorcycle and whatever size of the engine it is, unless you get on it, I don't think people would understand. My wife, she was on a motorcycle with me a couple of times. It's just that for her, after her car accident, she couldn't, her back issues, so she couldn't go on rides anymore. So to me, I feel like it's a little bit of a disconnect because she doesn't go to places with me, but she's not one of those people that does like, if I'm there, you can't do this. But she understands it. That's why she has no issues with it. She's not telling me, sell your motorcycles. You got to settle down. You're 39 years old. You're going to break something. If anything, she's been more of, very supportive. I bought one motorcycle last year, and 6 months later, I bought another one. She didn't say anything other than, "Hey, look, the garage has place for one more motorcycle." And I'm like,
"Oh, wow.
That's
don't
support
encourage
right there."
Yeah, I told her, don't encourage my decisions. That
Yeah, that's sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's it. I mean, it's if people, in my opinion, if you really want to understand, the responsibility, the way the traffic works, the way what's it called? Internal combustion engine works. The how do you say this? The responsibility of maintaining anything. I would say a motorcycle is one way to go. The reason saying is, if your tire blows, you only have one more left, right? Whereas in a car, if your tire blows, you have three left, and you can safely move aside. And not only that, but you're very shielded from the elements. I've been known to be caught in a couple of downpours in the last year. Well, this year alone, where everything counts. Your ability to stay awake, your ability to control the motorcycle on the road, your ability to stay alert when an 18-wheeler truck passes you by.
That'll wake you right up.
Right. And keeping up with the maintenance, especially if you have a chain-driven motorcycle and you're out on the rain, which tends to rust and, and all that stuff. And YouTube has been a pretty good teacher for these things. I'm not saying that anybody should go out and YouTube things like, critical race steering and learn it in like 15 minutes.
Right. Do your research, right?
Right. But I think you can learn in 15 minutes on how to maintain your motorcycle chain and change the sprockets, the front and back sprocket and stuff like that. That's something you can learn on YouTube really, really easily, something that we didn't have 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
This is like one of those answers that's not really a simple answer to give, even though it's like, hey, why do you like motorcycles? And why should people hop on a motorcycle?
No, I mean, it's a complex question. There's a lot of good reasons. There's a lot of various reasons, I think. And I think that what you're saying is right. I mean, I think that it ends up being very, very personal relationship you have with the motorcycle. Also, when you go on rides with people, you really bond with them in a way. And I think part of that is because it is so inherently dangerous. And I think there's something about sort of going through it inherently dangerous. I mean, we do all the safety stuff that we can do. And I'm not a reckless rider, I'm sure. And I know you're not either. I've ridden with you. But it is dangerous. And so, I think sort of going through that experience together can be very bonding. And there's something about it. Sean, now just to go around the horn here, Sean, how about you and your, when did you, how did you get into motorcycling? Just, I just want to just give you a chance to sort of talk about this too.
Sure. I mean, I'll just be real brief. I mean, my dad had a Honda 90 trail bike when I was a kid, and I actually ended up getting that bike when I was like 15. And I used to ride up in the mountains and do stuff, and I actually kind of ran it into a tree at one point.
Oh, man.
and messed up the bike. But then I got like a Yamaha 175 Enduro. And I used to ride that around quite a bit on dirt when I was, 14, 15 years old. And then later on, as an adult, I got a Yamaha street bike, a cruiser bike, and rode that, in the Malibu mountains for a few years. That's like 20 years ago. And so I didn't ride for the longest time. And I have to say, like, you guys both kind of make me crazy with your long trips and adventure riding, because even though I do have, experience going way back, I'm really still much more of a newbie, and I've got to up my game. I see your adventure videos, Christophe, and, I see your road videos where you're riding in the rain, Almir. And it's just, makes me feel like I have to up my game and get in better shape. I mean, this COVID quarantine has been debilitating in terms of not staying physically active, and you really need to be in good shape to be on a bike. So especially if you dump the bike over, you got to pick it up. It's only happened to me once since I got the new bike, but yeah, it was at a stop sign, no big deal, but it was quite an effort to get that thing back up by myself.
Yeah, an R, you have an R1250, which is a beautiful, I mean, absolutely gorgeous motorcycle. But also a very heavy one.
It's heavy, and I haven't remotely pushed the limits of what that bike can do. I'm still just taking it slow and easy, and
Sure.
Don't want to pop an accidental wheelie.
Yeah, and that bike will wheelie without even so easily. I mean, if it didn't, it's really a beautiful bike. And well, I am, and so for me, I watched The Long Way Around with Ewan McGregor and stuff like that, and that was whenever that came out, and that from that point forward, I was like, I want to do this, and I didn't really get into adventure motorcycling until much later, until very recently, actually. But I did do quite a bit of riding before that. So I really started in 2010. Well, 2010 really is when I started riding. And I took a course, and the course was great, and I was hooked. Like you guys, it was just like I was hooked. Like you said, Almir, a drug. It is just like it's just so great and so exhilarating, and there's so many different elements about it that I love. But so let's Almir, give our audience a bit of a background on you. In many ways, you have sort of a quintessentially immigrant to America origin story, and frankly, it's quite inspiring. So, to the extent that you are comfortable, will you share with us how you came to live in Western New Jersey?
Sure. Well, it's more like a refugee to U.S. citizenship. Came to the United States in 1993. Born in Bosnia. Was there up until 1992 when the Civil War started. And then my mom and my sister and myself kind of decided to make that trek outside of Bosnia, even though it was kind of like one of those making the trip across the mountains in like a Volkswagen van with blackout lights in the middle of the night, crossing the mountains and going to Croatia into the refugee camp in April of 1992, where my dad stayed behind for about a year because for males that were, fighting age, they were not allowed to leave. So it was my dad. If my dad left, he would have been taking a big chance of being taken, by the Croats or the Serbs at any of the checkpoints, and ended up probably in a concentration camp. He stayed behind for about a year. And then in 1993, in August, we were given a permission by the U.S. Embassy in Croatia to come to the United States. We moved to Connecticut first. We were there for about a year. And then my parents moved to New York, where they had a more of a substantial Balkan community. Her nieces and nephews actually lived here for a while. So we moved, found an apartment, and that was in 1994. And then up to 2004, I was really in New York, Queens. I finished college there. I did ROTC in St. John's while I was doing my computer science degree. And in 2004, May, commissioned to the U.S. Army, active duty, went down to Fort Benning for my training. I was down there till 2005. And then in 2006, I ended up in Afghanistan for 16 months up in 2007. And then leaving the active duty in 2008, moving down to Queens. And then in 2009, 2010, the job prospects changed, kind of like we're going through that recession. And in 2012, moved to New Jersey. We bought a house. My wife was finishing up her nursing degree. So up until 2017, she was in school. And, we bought a house here. We kind of, start a new life being away from my parents. That's a different story. But Eastern European upbringing, it's not really, it depends from family to family. My family wasn't so easy to deal with when it came down to things. But fast forward to 2021, we've been here for 9 years now.
Nice.
My wife is doing her DNP in Rutgers University here. I finished my master's in system engineering, and in about 3 years, I'll be out of the military for good, and kind of put an end to that chapter of my life for 20 years. So,
yeah, I mean, that is a really, first of all, just, inspiring story in some sense. I mean, it's just because, fleeing, right, that sort of situation, making it to the United States, and really just sort of, it just really reinforces this idea that folks that come from refugees especially, there is for example, the Vietnamese refugees after the war, refugees tend to really, in some sense, thrive, right? Because there's this sort of like this fervor of like, holy shit, I made it, I'm safe, and I want to contribute. And not only did you contribute, you end up you literally in the military, right? In the most profound way, really, in some ways, one can contribute to the nation. And just so everybody knows, I talked about this at the top, but you and I met through a friend of mine, because we went to that how do you say, the council meeting. And you remember, and you and I became friends. It was a virtual meeting, but we became friends after that. And so just talk about being a progressive in the county that you live in, which is not very progressive.
So, for myself, just a little background. I've really been keen into the things that I am right now, being in the military. And kind of like not being politically active, you kind of get ignorant to the things that are happening around you, right? So I would probably say, for me, the Great Awakening, or the way you want to put it, was probably in 2017 after the 2016 election, when you start kind of instead of being angry at the things that are happening, you kind of get introduced to people that say, like, don't get angry, like, understand why these things are happening. Like, here are some of the references you can explore. You can start reading, and so my journey kind of went from, and this is the rise of the YouTube right, as you want to say. Like in 2016, it was like the deviation between going down that rabbit hole to the right, and then actually, people, as they say, think for yourself, but thinking for myself has led me to the left, right? Where I kind of got into the point where I started learning about my own background, about my own country, like, where I was born, the reasons why things were happening. Also, like the things that are happening in the United States. And even though, the things that you said, being a refugee coming to United States, I think, and in my honest opinion, coming from Europe, refugees that come from Europe and the refugees that come from anywhere else in the world in the United States have a completely different experience, because based on their skin color, right? Because as much as people or humans don't like to say this, we are very visual based people. And if you see somebody that's out of place, you're more likely to have a bias against them, or a different bias, as opposed to somebody that looks like you, right?
For sure.
So moving to Sussex County in 2012, being the privilege that I was born into, people didn't really look at me differently. Right. And even in the military, or even, the people that I used to and still associate with, tend to share some of the alternative views on people that they have. Right. Like, one of my colleagues at work during lunchtime, we got into talking about refugees, and he basically said, like, well, you know how it is. These people never leave, and and you should know, right? I'm like, well, is this because I came to the United States and when I was young, and 12 years later, this was my home, right? This is the country of what I like to call home. And I asked him, I was like, well, if I'm an example and I'm a first generation American and you're like sixth generation Dutch, what is there for you to say? Like, why didn't your family come to the United States and then leave? Right.
Right. Exactly. It's a great point.
Right. And going to the native, the Native Americans or who the natives are here, how is it that you didn't come back? And like, it's one of those like jarring conversation pieces where he kind of like, or he or she, like they pivot. This is more than one person. They pivot to more like, well, we had the weapons and the arms to, like they should have fought us, right? And
what
I'm
a
like,
crazy thing to say.
Yeah, victim blaming.
Right. Well, right, but it's not even that. It's like the guy. It's like one of those ignorant statements, right? Like he's a very good person. Like he's one of my veteran friends, and like he has come and helped us out when we needed help. He wouldn't hurt a person. It's just that sometimes those ignorant statements. I think people fail to analyze them, right? Because it's like, people always say like, well, individualism, right? Okay, well, you should have individually thought about what you said. And then people like, well, might makes right? Where the Eastern Europeans or the Western Europeans had the weapons and the inability to kind of analyze the culture, the farming, and why it led to advancement in weaponry in Europe and not in the United States or in Americas with the Native Americans. That's kind of like what we're talking about right now in our society, where it comes down to, critical race theory. It's not about like, you're white, you should apologize, but it's more like, hey, you're white, or you're an American, you kind of need to realize that this is the privilege that you were born into. It's not your fault there were slaves, but you should kind of understand why there's a discrepancy between, Black people in the United States and white people in the United States, Hispanic people and Native Americans. It's like, it's not that anybody's making you say you're sorry everywhere you go. It's more of like, these laws were based on the privilege to keep people down. It's not
Absolutely.
that me as a white person should go around apologizing to everybody, even though I came to the United States in 93. My parents had nothing to do with it, but there's a certain privilege that they were born into where they were never racially profiled in the United States.
Right.
They were able to, no fault of their own, talk their way out of a ticket, speeding ticket or a red light ticket or stuff like that. They were able to buy a house. They were able to get credit without being looked at their race. They were able to pay rent on their apartment without being gouged, having to pay like, 6 months ahead in their, what's it called?
Security deposit.
Deposit. Right. It's stuff like that. And when people, and I've encountered this, it's like, well, it's not my fault. I'm like, nobody's saying it's your fault. It's more of like, don't talk about it if you don't understand it. You know?
That's a constant refrain. Sean, what were you about to say?
Well, I was going to just say I would settle for just white people admitting that Native Americans and Black people had harder lives. Like, that's all. Like, just admit, just acknowledge that it was not fun to go through that experience of being conquered or enslaved.
Right. It's just like as if, and it's just like so crazy that we have to say that out loud, but we really, really do. And I really think it's important, Almir, I think what you brought up there is an important distinction, right? Coming in as an immigrant, say from Haiti, or from Somalia or frankly from say Saudi Arabia is a really different experience than coming as a refugee or an immigrant from Eastern Europe or Western Europe, right? There is, and really it comes down to the color of the skin. Let's be frank about that, right?
Well, I don't know when it was, but I don't like talking about Trump, but I don't remember when he said it, but he basically said that he would like more people from Norway than from other countries. And if that doesn't tell you what that, where that thinking goes into, right? I mean, you don't have to tell him he's racist, but that's just the thinking that like you kind of go to. It's weird.
Yeah,
right? It's
dog whistles,
we all have
dog foghorns.
Right. We all have biases, right? Like, and that could be because we watch too much TV, we watch too much Law and Order, we watch too much The Wire or stuff like that, where people don't understand, but all those shows kind of sculpt your thinking when you're walking in, let's say, Harlem, or you're walking on the street of East New York, or you're walking, you're in Brooklyn, or you're in Newark, or you're in any of these places that have a negative connotation when it comes down to Law and Order, or any other procedural shows that you look at. It's people don't understand that even though you might not think that way, the TV and everything that you watch play into the forming the psyche that you form against or for the people that you deal with on a daily basis. A good example of that is Christopher Columbus. Let's look at that guy real quick. I mean, I don't really remember learning anything negative about him when I was in school.
It's a great point. And he was just like a hero, right?
Right. And going from that guy, going to, Martin Luther King Jr., and how all these conservatives latch onto his name and saying like, well, why can't you just do things the way he did? He was a peaceful person. He did things peacefully. Why does the BLM have to, riot and all that stuff? I'm like, well, I don't have 3 credits worth of material to talk to you about in 15 minutes right now. and I don't want to be the guy that says, here, read these books, or go to the, public library and tell the librarian, hi, I'm an ignorant person. Please educate me on this, on these things. I just don't think that I should be. I mean, I don't know everything. I have a lot to go when it comes down to, being satisfied with my knowledge. But it kind of irks me when people that don't even know who Frederick Douglass is talk about critical race theory.
Oh, that's a really great point.
Or talk about how the slave owners were really the guys who wanted to end slavery because they didn't want to clothe and feed all these slaves. And I'm like, yeah, because these people grew up in 5-star, hotels, and they were eating, like 2 Michelin star food. Yeah. In return of could you please, pick this cotton for us? We'll feed you.
Right. No. Sean, I want to give you a chance to jump in here.
There's so many of these tropes like this, and we Christophe and I have talked about it all the time. Martin Luther King was murdered, by a white supremacist.
Right.
There's the one little detail they don't mention, and the other detail is like you get people like Larry Elder, who just recently said that he thought that slave owners were the ones who should get reparations because they had their property taken from them. Ugh. And it's like there are just so many of these ignorant attitudes and ideas flying around that it's almost hard to imagine.
It really, really is. Well, guys,
cops.
Speaking of cops, I want to and firemen and everything else. I want to move on to our sort of heavy topic because Saturday was the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. We all know what happened on that fateful day, and we are all aware of the 20-year war that day spawned. What's less known, or at least it was to me, is how capitalism actually cost some lives that day, and more than it typically does. The Washington Post reports, quote, had the World Trade Center been built in the late 1960s and early 1970s, been erected according to the building code in effect since 1938, it is likely that a very different World Trade Center would have been built. Instead, it was constructed according to a new code that the real estate industry had avidly promoted. a code that made it cheaper and more lucrative to build and own skyscrapers. It increased the floor space available for rent, cutting back on the areas that had been devoted under earlier law to evacuation and exit. The result: getting everyone out on 9/11 was virtually impossible. Under the new rules, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was able to rent 3/4 of each floor of the World Trade Center, a 21% increase over the yield of older skyscrapers. And the cost was dear. Some 1,000 people inside the North Tower who initially survived the impact of American Airlines Flight 11 could not reach an open staircase. Their fate was sealed nearly 4 decades earlier when the staircases were clustered in the core of the building and fire stairs were eliminated as a wasteful use of valuable space. The towers embodied the power of American capitalism, but their design embodied the folly of American greed. On that day, both conditions proved fatal. End quote. Now, Almir, would you like to react to that passage? Doesn't capitalism poison everything?
Well, Christophe, I just want to say that you reading that article makes you a socialist communist and an anti-patriotic American, because you are diverting to the fact that a bunch of people from a place that I don't like flew some planes into buildings because they don't like the way Americans live, right? That was my way of segueing into this. The issue here, and the article that you quoted, and the underlying issue is that if you actually posted something that's publicly not public knowledge to your friends on social media and stuff like that, they will probably call you out for not caring for those 3,500 innocent Americans that have died that day, right? But absolutely, I think that the as they say, crony capitalism, regardless what it is, state capitalism or private capitalism, takes advantage of the people that don't have any power to make policies or to represent themselves in a public discourse. Yeah. Where I know tomorrow, I know on the 11th, I know that, there are going to be a lot of flags that are going to be flown, half-mast, and we're going to talk about all the people that we've lost on that day. But we really don't talk about the human price that the Americans have paid since that day. Since, let's say, 8 o'clock in the morning on the 11th, but the tragedy that started, on the next day, or let's say 1 minute after midnight, leading us on to the, September 12th, where we started a 20-year war that, unless you're living under the rock, in the past couple of weeks, we pulled completely out, and whatever we have built in the last 20 years has collapsed, not even as dominoes, because dominoes, when they collapse, you can see it coming. It's the government, the Afghan government, the Afghan military, the Afghan infrastructure collapsed almost immediately. And I don't know about you, but when somebody builds a house, when a contractor builds a house, even though contractors in the United States would love to have this, the second they finish building a house and then they leave, there's something wrong if that house collapses almost immediately. Right?
They must have done something not right.
Right. And the way that the September 11th is still being used as a sacrifice, as something that Americans endured, I don't think we're seeing the bigger picture here. I don't think that a lot of people are actually cognizant on going back and realizing that we can't be patriotic without fixing the underlying issues that we have with the system that we support, knowingly or unknowingly. Whereas we've asked our least privileged, let's put it that way, least privileged members of society to go and fix issues 10,000 miles away from their own homes without understanding that they've been plucked outside of their own underprivileged societies and communities to go and do this. Because a lot of these young men and women in the military usually join the military because there is no other way out of the society that they're in. There is, they're the only person capable of serving and providing for their families, or they want to stop the cycle of poverty. So they leave their house and they join, because everywhere since the beginning of times, military service has been something that people were always proud of.
Sure.
And
they should be.
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the issue that I have after 20 years of being in Afghanistan is that we have nothing to show for it.
Yeah.
Right. That nothing. we have lost not only American lives. We care about American lives because we live in the United States, and a lot of people like to use that as cannon fodder for especially now when there's a different president in the office. We like to use that as a reason to go back, right? Because many times I've heard it of like, I don't want my combat to be for nothing. I don't want the deaths of Americans to be for nothing. But yet, in any war, especially the ones that we engage ourselves against non-white people, we forget to mention the cost of that war for the people who are native to those countries, right? And my experience has been, I've talked to a bunch of people there through my interpreter. Was, Americans leave. We have the privilege of serving in Afghanistan and leaving, right? Where I went to Afghanistan in 2006 and I came home in 2007. Whereas the people in villages and towns and, the areas that I visited are probably still there, and they have to deal with the repercussions of helping the Americans or going against the grain. I mean, how would we? I mean, same thing happened in the United States, but centuries ago, where people who were loyalists after the American Revolution had to leave the country, the new United States, to go back to Britain because of the repercussions of them being collaborators.
Or and Canada. They went to Canada too. Some.
Right.
We forget all these things because we don't focus on these itty bitty intricate issues in our history classes. This goes back to our education system where we are very test oriented. We have, we just listen, let me get a 95 on this test and you can pass and take your SATs, get a perfect score, go to Harvard, right?
Yeah.
Then by going to Harvard, I'm going to get a good job, but we don't do a good job.
That gets us back to the capitalism thing, right?
Right. Yeah. Asking questions.
Right. Full circle.
Yeah. That's another branch that it's going down that thing. I think we'll be here to
we'll be here all day. So
a week from today. Yeah.
Sean, I just want to give you a chance, Sean, to comment on 9/11 as well. What are your thoughts?
I want to circle back a little bit and just say, sure. Almir, how ironic I think it is that you have been directly involved in two different wars, right?
Yeah.
Like that's crazy. You escape one war only to go fight in another war, in a similar part of the world. I mean, Afghanistan is not that far from your home country, so it's just right?
It's wild.
Well, I mean, culturally, it's completely different.
Yes.
I had the advantage of of growing up in a or being born in a socialist government before it collapsed, right? You know, a lot of people like to point to communism and socialism as being the issue why, you know, governments fall apart and why people don't have enough to eat, but they never look at the political issues against it. So just recently, about probably a year ago, I started looking at some U.S. Congress issues that they've passed. And in 1991, I don't remember details. I'm going to have to look this up again. But the U.S. Congress voted on the IMF giving financial rescue or help to the Yugoslav area only if they had fair elections. Now, we probably heard that before in South America when it comes to other countries that have some kind of a socialist or labor movements.
Yep.
And we all know how that worked out.
Yep.
But here we are, you know, 16 years after the end of the war, where all the Yugoslav republics are separate. They exercise crony capitalism, where everything has been privatized, where and people say, like, you know, hey, you know, capitalism helps people and communism destroys countries, right? I mean, that's one way of looking at it. If you are incapable of reading books and analysis, but also the nationalism issue is also a huge problem. Where communism was in Yugoslavia, but underlying nationalism and the way that United States and the Western European countries influenced the breakup of these countries is not. It's not an easy subject. It's not a 15-minute PragerU video that you can watch.
No, it's not.
It's volumes of books that don't, it's not something that people. It's not sexy, right? It's not something that people go and have a movie night about it, or like, hey, let's read books about Balkans, right?
And
Yeah,
the thing is
Sean.
about the whole deal too is that the United States has always been involved in making countries safe for capitalism. That's been our primary goal. And that's all of this hypocritical patriotism that you get. And this is frankly why I am so tired of the 9/11 hoopla that happens every year. I mean, I certainly want to honor the victims, okay? And I certainly want to honor people who've served in our military because they had nothing to do with any of this. But I'm just bone tired of how the whole thing has been used to justify all of this kind of American, efforts to support, what's good for corporations, what's good for the banks, what's good for military contractors all over the world. And, and then there's also a double standard in terms of valuing life, right? We have 9/11 deaths, around 3,000, Afghanistan war deaths, about 2,000. COVID has exceeded 9/11's casualty counts by a factor of like 200. Okay.
Right.
And there's this selective outrage over, 9/11 coupled with the silence on accountability for COVID deaths. And this is all part of this rah-rah capitalist mindset, right? If it's the military, it's good. If it's it's something that we have to do, an obligation we have to take care of in our own country, now it doesn't matter. So that hypocrisy is just killing me. And it's why I don't even want to necessarily even participate in any 9/11 celebrations. Yeah. And, I don't know how much time we have, but I could write a book about what went wrong on 9/11 from an engineering standpoint and talk about that. And there's already been a lot of books about it. But one thing I do know about construction methods is that the towers were super unique architecturally. And that's one of the things that contributed to why they fell and why people weren't able to get out. And the main difference is that structurally, most skyscrapers use the core as structural support, right? And the Twin Towers use the skin mostly, right? And so there was a span between the skin of the towers, which, by the way, went from 4 inches thick at the bottom to only a 1/4 inch thick at the top, because it was literally a sort of pyramidal structure of this metal. Normally, that exterior metal is like cladding; that's over concrete. But on the Twin Towers, it was actually structural, and that was what was holding up these giant concrete slabs that were each floor, right? So that is why people couldn't get out, is because of that change in the design. And there was actually an incident that occurred, I think it was in the 1930s, where a plane hit the Empire State Building, and the building did not collapse. And It was a pretty big plane that hit the Empire State Building, and it just killed people on that floor. It didn't kill, the whole building didn't fall down. So. Without belaboring this point, there's a really good book called 102 Minutes. It's by Kevin Flynn and Jim Dwyer. And
it's outstanding.
It's outstanding. And there's so much irony in those stories of who escaped and who didn't and why. And then there's the NIST report, which everybody should have read. I read that like 20 years ago when it came out. And that should have immediately put to rest any of the conspiracy theories. And of course, it fucking didn't.
Of course it didn't.
Wrapping this up, there's no way to stop capitalists from gutting regulations without cracking down on corruption in society generally. And that would require a sustained prosecutorial effort that would be attacked before it could even get started. And I just don't know at this point how you begin rooting out, that kind of corruption from a system. It's already figured out how to take down any reformers using slander and dirty tricks. Basically, if you're a reformer, they brand you as a troublemaker. They trot out some scandal. They'll find some prostitute to take you down. There's always a way of taking down reformers, and I don't know, that's probably not in our scope of the show today. But this is how reforms are blocked: is through creating counter narratives and counter scandals.
Yeah, that's really an interesting point, Sean. And one of the things, I read that book as well, and one of the things that really got me was the lack of communication between the fire and the police people. Like, basically, after 1993, they didn't, there were some lessons were learned, but certainly not enough. And one of the takeaways that I had was that basically the fire department is an old boys club, was an old boys club. The NYPD was an old boys club, and there was a rivalry, and they had their old way of doing things, and they just didn't want to change. I mean, you had things where people were like, "Oh, well, we just don't like these radios because we used to do it this way, so we're going to stick with these." Like so many layers of this kind of just well, that's the way we always did it. And then afterward, right, there was this whole heroes narrative, and absolutely heroes and all that, but so many firemen died unnecessarily, because literally just because they didn't have the radios that they needed to understand what was actually going on. And so we should definitely, like you're saying, Sean, I also get really annoyed with the sort of with the 9/11 sort of narrative that you hear, not because the people that we shouldn't be sorry that people died, not because not because we shouldn't honor heroes, we should all, and certainly people who went and fought, but because what it does is it obscures the systemic problems that led to it in the fucking first place. One of which that you have how do you say, developers writing the building code. I mean, come on, right? Come on. This sort of thing, that's a systemic problem. You have a problem where the fire department and the NYPD are acting like two brothers that can't get along instead of people. This is sort of systemic problems that frankly, I don't know the extent that they've been really sort of dealt with at this point, But anyway, that's my takeaway.
They haven't. And if you actually look at this condo collapse in Miami, there's all kinds of problems with not only regulations, but inspections and then payoffs. And it just goes on and on. And it's really interesting because as bad as we have it here, it's way worse in other places.
Right. Way worse. Right. The corruption is way deeper. Right. You want to comment on that, Almir?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to get caught up in the, things in the United States are bad, but look at Afghanistan. They don't have any roads, right?
Right. Right.
It's like, okay, yeah, but before we start exporting our policies to a country that we have helped destroy in the 1990s and in 2000s and so on and so forth, let's fix our own backyard, right? Because I think it was reported that NYPD has a budget of like $6 billion a year. And yet in a past year and a half, they have around 1,000 officers dying from COVID.
Wow.
So what are they spending their money on? Right. It also going back to, the regulations, building regulations. I remember watching a little bit of a segment of Joe Rogan and Rubin report, right? They were going back and forth about, and this is, I'll give Joe Rogan some credit here. When Rubin was saying all these regulations are stifling growth, right? And he's like, look at the building regulations, and Joe Rogan's like, wait, you do understand that these building regulations actually help homeowners, because how many stories have we ever heard that all these builders, all these contractors are willing to do the right thing, the expensive thing, without these codes being written? Because people go like, oh, these building codes, they're gonna cost me thousands of dollars to abide by them, but they don't understand the reason why they exist structurally. When I was redoing my kitchen, I was reading up on these things, like you can't have an outlet this close to a water source because of obvious reasons. The water and electricity don't really, work together. They throw some sparks. They can electrify the water, creating a hazard for you to walk. I want to grab a glass of water. You could die if there is, a short circuit in your outlet and you have a leak. I understand that that's fear mongering to these people, but it's a possibility. A good example is Texas last year.
Oh my God.
Where, all these builders didn't abide by the code, or Texas doesn't have codes. And that's why people, or these builders, were able to quote a price and then do a half-assed job insulating pipes, insulating electrical conduits, insulating motors for electricity, for water, and stuff like that. And we saw what kind of disaster that happened. But people forgot, because why? Because Texas, well, first of all, it was an election year, or it happened earlier this year. I'm sorry, like everything has, all these 2 years have gone into like a 24-hour period. So everything is like, well, it happened 10 years ago, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think your point is a really good one, and that is, like, some things are, like, the market forces are great for a lot of things, but you can't just, certainly safety, you can't just throw that into the market and say, like, oh, or utilities, and just be like, all right, let's just see what happens. Let's see, because like you say, right, it is the lowest cut. Basically, everyone will try and cut costs. I mean, that is sort of the natural thing to do, right?
Well, and with buildings, it's particularly bad because it's very easy to hide the evidence. Okay. I mean, in this country, we actually have pretty good concrete regulations, but in other countries, sometimes the concrete is so soft that it will just crumble in your hand. Right. And a building can actually stand up with concrete that's like that until there's even a slight earthquake or some sort of natural disaster. And then the whole thing falls. And the same thing here, the same reason why people couldn't get out of the stairwells in the Twin Towers is the same reason why your home might fall down 20 years after the fact. And you would have no way of knowing that there was this design defect when you bought it. And that's the reason why these building codes are so important. And Republicans it's criminal. Like, what they're doing is criminal when they try to destroy these codes.
I couldn't agree more. Almir, I want to just sort of jump into your experience in Afghanistan at this point. I know you were on the ground there. So what, if anything, do you want to express to our audience about the experience of being in the military in Afghanistan, about being a combat veteran, the entire experience? Like, what? I just want to give you the floor here. What are we missing about that experience?
Wow, where to begin? From my experience 5 years after September 11th, being there, being I was 24 years old. I was pretty immature when it came down to, the mission that we had in Afghanistan.
What were you told was your mission?
I mean, we went in there hoping to change lives of the Afghan people, to nation build, to ensure that they can go on with their daily lives, which I would say, as an infantryman, as an officer at that time, I don't think we were ready. I don't think we were in any way capable of understanding not only the cultural differences, but the systems that were lacking in Afghanistan to build that government up from zero, especially in a country that had a civil war every 5 years, and people in that country didn't share a common language or a common culture, because you leave one little village and on the other side of the mountains, they have a different dialect, they have a different structure. And then, you drive 5 kilometers down a valley and, you meet some villagers from a little village that's right next to the river that is completely different from the place that you visited 15 minutes ago. And their concerns are completely different than the people in Kabul, in Jalalabad, Asadabad, all these cities, because I don't think that people, especially reactionaries, the American reactionaries, don't understand, or they do know, they do understand that there's a difference between an Afghan in Kabul and an Afghan in Panjshir, or Afghan in the Korengal Valley, or Afghan in the southern province of Afghanistan, outside of Kandahar, or outside of Zabul. That they have different concerns, that they have different issues that they have to take care of on a daily basis. And I'm going to be honest, I was pretty ignorant on this too. Why? Because you take an American soldier that has grown up not really worrying about the government functioning, and you're tossing them into a country that has no infrastructure, right? That has no capability to sustain themselves, not because they are not an advanced culture, but because they have no means, or they have never developed it. It's just that because they have never worried about it, right? It's like, going to Brazil, going into the Amazon and finding all these tribes that have no need for an iPhone. It doesn't mean that they are, not your equals when it comes to culture. It just means that they never worried about it, right? Like, kids don't worry about the latest PlayStations that have come out, or the latest iPhones that have been built in China, or things like that. It's just, there's different concerns. And when you pluck a child or an 18-year-old out of high school in United States, in, I don't know, Tennessee, and you put them in Afghanistan, they're going to use their own, why can't you be like me? Why is this 19-year-old adult behaving differently than me? They don't understand it. It's almost the same as taking a person that lived in New York City his whole life and somebody that lives in Mobile, Alabama. But the thing is, they do share the American standard of living, whatever that may be, and a common language. Whereas in Afghanistan, cities, villages, they don't share that cohesion as they do United
Right.
States. Even though, you'll hear about, oh, you Yankees do it this way. Oh, you're from New Jersey, like, oh, we do it differently in Alabama and stuff like that. It's not so clear cut. And this goes back down to, I think, in United States, being that we have a very good example of what the government can do for the people if it's properly funded, versus what the government can do for the people if it's properly corrupt.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Because if the United States had an occupying military right now, I think a lot of people forget to realize that there are some things that would be common to the Afghans and to Americans at the same time, regardless of where they grew up.
Yeah.
Right.
So Almir, what was your role in Afghanistan? So I know I read your bio, but just let us know, what did you do there?
So majority of my time, I worked as a provided security for provincial reconstruction team, which was a team that was based out of American base, whose only priority or only task was to hire engineers, hire local builders and stuff and people like that to build up the infrastructure of a town or a city or for instance, a couple of things that we were involved with. Well, the Air Force people there were building a well, building a girls' school, and here's, I'm going to show some American ignorance here, that the female colonel that I worked with, her major concern was to get these up-armored Toyotas to the provincial governor, because the guy before him was murdered right in front of the government building.
Wow.
And she wanted, this was her priority. She harped on it every meeting that we went to. And right before I redeployed back to the United States, these 4 beautiful 2007 Land Cruisers arrived on our base at, and I'm not kidding you, a sticker price of $250,000 each.
Oh my God.
Yeah. I don't want to speculate what happened to those Land Cruisers post-Taliban takeover, but I'm pretty sure that they were either in disrepair or they're being utilized right now. But
yeah, I'm sure they are. I want to read an excerpt, guys, and I'd love for you, especially Almir, but all of us, to sort of respond to it. I'm quoting now from the Washington Post. A confidential trove of government documents obtained by the Washington Post reveals that senior U.S. officials failed to tell the truth about the war in Afghanistan throughout the 18-year campaign, making rosy pronouncements they knew to be false and hiding unmistakable evidence that the war had become unwinnable. The documents were generated by a federal project examining the root failures of the longest armed conflict in U.S. history. They include more than 2,000 pages of previously unpublished notes of interviews with people who played a direct role in the war, from generals and diplomats to aid workers and Afghan officials. The U.S. government tried to shield the identities of the vast majority of those interviewed for the project and conceal nearly all of their remarks, but the Post won release of the documents under a Freedom of Information Act after a 3-year battle. And here is just some of the stuff that was in there, and I just want to read it really quickly. If Iraq was the war born of lies, then Afghanistan was the one nurtured by them. Afghanistan was where al-Qaeda, supported by the Taliban, had made its base. It was supposed to be the good war, the right war, the war of necessity and not choice, the war endorsed at home and abroad. U.S. officials had no need to lie or spin to justify the war. Yet leaders at the White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department soon began to make false assurances and to paper over setbacks on the battlefield. As the years passed, the deceit became entrenched. What had been called, quote, an unspoken conspiracy to hide the truth. Commanding generals privately admitted that they long fought the war, quote, without a functioning strategy. That 2 years into the conflict, Rumsfeld complained that he, quote, had no visibility into what the bad guys are. A former coordinator of Iraq and Afghanistan policy acknowledged that, quote, we didn't have the foggiest idea what we were undertaking. The U.S. officials long wanted to withdraw Afghanistan forces, but feared, correctly so it turns out, that the Afghan government might collapse. Bin Laden hoped for this exact scenario to lure the U.S. superpower into an unwinnable guerrilla conflict that would deplete its national treasure and diminish its global influence. All along, top officials publicly contradicted these internal views, issuing favorable accounts of steady progress, bad news twisted into good. Rising suicide attacks in Kabul meant the Taliban was too weak for combat, for instance, while increased U.S. casualties meant America was taking the fight to the enemy. The skill and size of the Afghan security forces were frequently exaggerated. By the end of President Barack Obama's second term, U.S. officials concluded that some 30,000 Afghan soldiers on the payroll didn't even exist. They were paper creations of local commanders who pocketed the fake soldiers' salaries at U.S. taxpayers' expense. End quote. Now, Almir, does that piss you off? Or, like, how do you respond to that? How do you, what does that make you feel like as a person who served?
I'm not surprised. It's, don't want to be the guy that's going to be, saying, I told you so. But I told you so. Reading numerous books written by American ambassadors and people who had direct contact with the Mujahideen back in 1980, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that the bureaucracy that safeguards the system has reacted this way. If you look at the generals that were in charge of all these missions in CENTCOM, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the like, even Africa, where have they gone after retirement? Right?
Yeah.
Our current civilian workforce, especially those that are in the decision-making levels, General Austin, for instance, when I was coming to Fort Drum, he was the commanding general of 10th Mountain. After he retired, and I believe up until last year, he was on the board of directors for Raytheon. And now he's making decisions for our defense strategy. I'm not saying that he's a corrupt individual. Mm-hmm. He might be a fine, defense secretary. It's just that the background that he has and that he transitioned from the military into Raytheon, who's one of the biggest military contractors, and then coming into the Department of Defense at the SecDef position doesn't really give me I'm not really confident that he's going to make decisions that are helping not only the people in the sphere of influence of the United States, but the United States military and the contractors that we are beholden to.
Yeah.
He might be an outstanding person. He might even be a progressive, but that doesn't bode well. His background doesn't really bode well. Yes, he is a black officer, a general, which is no small feat in the United States military.
For sure.
I'm not taking it away from him.
It's interesting because if you without casting any aspersions on General Austin, okay, if you want accountability, you cannot create conflicts of interest.
That's right.
You just can't. And so, you put good people into a bad situation like that, and what you end up having is the same thing that we had in Afghanistan, which was the number one goal of Osama bin Laden was to bleed the U.S. of money through long-term military entanglements. And he accomplished that. Check, right? Mm-hmm. The next goal was to empower our own internal hardliners, the Republicans. He did that. Check. Okay. He stoked internal divisions by causing us to immediately suspect anyone of Arab descent and even people who were from India who had nothing to do, who were just happened to be brown, right?
Sikhs
right? were being attacked after 9/11. So
yeah, right. Don't bring that up, because then people will talk about you being woke and worrying about the Sikh population in the United States because, American patriotism, right?
Well, God, I mean, it's just like these would have been his, I don't read Osama bin Laden, but I can pretty much promise you that these were his goals when launching this attack, because he knew that it wasn't going to beat us militarily, but he knew that he could create, this was like acid, at the foundations of our nation. And particularly when you consider our infrastructure, which is rotting. Okay. And if you can imagine how if we'd taken $6 trillion and put that into our own infrastructure, just in terms of energy. Okay. And I've done this.
That's socialism. Don't talk about socialism like that.
You can't, but it's like we can build it for other people. We can build it for Afghans and then have it get taken over. Like, okay, $6 trillion. Real quick math, 100 million complete home solar power systems at $30,000 each. Free. Give away 100 million. That's like 100 million families can have free electricity now, okay? And then you can also give them each a $30,000 electric car, 100 million of those. That's what $6 trillion equals, okay? And that's the same price as the Afghan war. And we would have cut our oil consumption by half, probably our carbon emissions by half or 2/3. And, instead we now have a nation that's a shadow of what it once was in the year 2000. We've got a larger GDP now, but our political system is in tatters. We've got a huge fount of disinformation and propaganda that we just allow to just bleed all over us. We've got, we're full of openly expressed racism and hatred, and tens of millions of people are teetering on the edge of poverty. I mean, I can't imagine a worse or more an outcome that would be more in line with what Osama bin Laden wanted to have happen to our country.
Yeah, I've thought about this the same way, Sean, and that is like, right, if he was playing the long game, he has won. I mean, right, and that's such an awful thing to say. We killed him, right? Al-Qaeda was kicked out. The Taliban were kicked out, right? Like there was a lot of positive things that happened, but the long game, and I think the biggest one that you mentioned there, Sean, I've been thinking about this a lot, and that is basically right in the same way that Russia tries to sow disinformation, right? Because that's how you take down a superpower, right? Mm-hmm. Basically, because we're a democrat, well, at least theoretically a democracy, so you have to break down consensus. That's what you have to do, right? You have to destroy consensus. And that is what the Russians do with their disinformation. And that is exactly what Osama bin Laden did in the long term, right? And I think the things that you brought up were really critical. So, it's scary to think that way. It's kind of, we're like, holy shit, did this guy win? But I mean, and like going back to what you said, Almir, it's like, what do we have to show for it after 20 years? All we have is an empowered right wing, a democracy that is on life support, right? And religious zealots, ironically, religious zealots taking power in the United States. If you're Osama bin Laden, you're like, cha-ching, and I won. And that's an awful thing to say, and the Afghanistan papers, all of that is for me, it just looks like human nature. It looks like people seeing what they want to see, believing what they want to believe, and not wanting to pay political consequences. I mean, probably some good faith stuff. You're talking about General Austin. I'm sure he's a really decent guy. But when you throw people, and to go to your point, Sean, when you put good people in bad situations, right? bad things happen, and this is where we end up. Well, guys, we are sort of at the end of our time, believe it or not. But Almir, I want you to to have a moment just to say whatever you want to say, whether it be about Afghanistan or motorcycling or how much you hate hearing my voice, whatever you want to talk about. Just give you the last word.
Yeah, it's just to iterate what we just talked about.
Absolutely, go for it.
I like reading books about World War II and the partisan movement in Yugoslavia. I've read very thick books written by some of the scholars, the American scholars. And one of the reasons why Hitler lost the Eastern Front to the Soviet military, not only because the Soviet military recovered, is because Yugoslavia and Tito and the partisans opened up another front for him to worry about. Mm-hmm. So I think that the Yugoslav front took about 6 to 8 divisions of the German military from the Eastern Front to the Yugoslav front to kind of ensure that the partisans were, resistance was stifled. So that's no small feat. That's 6 to 8 divisions not fighting against the Russians. And that's something that Stalin kind of pushed for in 1942, 1943. That goes to, I think Osama bin Laden never had the intention of beating us militarily because you can't. Not only you can't, but we have gone to such extent of technological advancements that we've kind of forgotten how to do things interpersonally, right? Walking, talking to people and stuff like that. Something that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are pretty good at. Mm-hmm. Just to recap our war on terror 20 years later, after President Bush declared that the Taliban is no more, that Al-Qaeda has no influence in Afghanistan, that the Afghan people have the U.S. government and a nation as influencing their way forward. 20 years later, both Iraq and Afghanistan are devoid of U.S. military presence, whereas the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are back and influencing the area. Not only influencing, but they have plethora of equipment that they can sell.
Yeah, ours.
Equipment that they can use. I'm not talking about Black Hawks, because Black Hawks, tanks, stuff like that works on motors is very complex to maintain. Even we have issues maintaining that equipment. I don't think they're going to be as proliferate as that. They might sell it to somebody else. But they have the technology right now, and the U.S. government will have to acknowledge them, at least the Taliban, as the rightful government of Afghanistan. Whereas 20 years ago, we had a chance to force them to have diplomatic discourse with the political parties in Afghanistan, because they are secular Afghans. Yes, they are communists in Afghanistan. Yes, they are Democrats. In 2001, they could have played a role in forming that government and informing their people, creating a nation from the ground up, whereas now they either have to be gone into hiding, or they are somewhere in Europe, or had the luck to jump on one of those planes to come to a more progressive country. And it's one of those, we were here, the apex has been reached in 2001, not 2020, and we've been sliding down with the influence ever since. Taliban didn't go from 0 to 100% of Afghan control. They controlled about 75% of Afghanistan last year. This didn't happen overnight. You might look at it because the media wants you to care now, whereas 10 years ago, it was the forgotten war.
Absolutely.
And I hope that this kind of spurs people's intellectual ability to want to go and research and read books. I read a really good book. Let me get it real quick. The Wars of Afghanistan by Peter Thompson. And he was the Afghan attaché back in 1980s. And he writes about the conflicts that he had, not only with Afghans, but the Pakistan government and the CIA back in 1980s that didn't enable him to do his job.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And that's it. That's what I just wanted to put out there. And
that was really, really great and really, really useful, Almir. We'll put that book in the show notes along with the other articles and books that we've mentioned here, like 102 Minutes, which everyone should go read. So anyway, Almir, thank you so much for being with us today. It was a lot of fun, very informative, and hopefully we'll be able to have you back again.
I appreciate the platform. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely, and I'll see you out there on the road, and we'll have some tacos.
We'll definitely have tacos.
All right, man. Take it easy. Well, that was really great talking to Almir. I think, he has a really sort of unique perspective, an interesting perspective. I love hearing these stories of folks that came to the United States and really built something and have really contributed, and who are, not that is a requirement, but he did do those things. And he is a pretty impressive guy from that perspective. Do you have any final thoughts, Sean?
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. I was very impressed with him. And, somebody's personality really doesn't come through on Facebook. And if you haven't talked to someone face to face, and really just hearing him talk and seeing how grounded he is for, given the experiences that he's had, what he's been through, and how much he is, this is what makes America great, damn it. Is having people come here and become one of us. And that is true of him in spades.
That's so true. And you become one of us and then change us, right? Because that's how it works, right? Like, we evolve, right? We grow with them. We become better as a result of that. And that is something that I think is hard for conservatives for whatever reason to, we can talk about all the fucking reasons. We spent the last year plus talking about all those fucking reasons, and we will continue talking about those reasons. But seriously, it was really a joy to have him here. Almir, if you're listening to this, again, thank you for being here, and I'll see you out there for some tacos. Now remember, please, everyone out there, if you like our show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and really go leave a review. Come on, do it. Check out our Patreon and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. And we publish new articles weekly at our journal at theradicalsecular.com. I'm Christophe Defoe. Thank you for being here. And remember that wherever you are, you can be radically secular.
The Radical Secular podcast is written and produced by Christophe Defoe, Sean Prophet, Joe Okipinti, and Drew Scott. Artwork and design by Tim Stetner. Post-production and theme music by Sean Prophet. Special thanks to our support team, Lindsay Brightman, Jillian Sky Jacobs, and Lori Field Okipinti.